So I have with me today somebody extremely special to me and definitely to the world, and the world of film in particular. If there's anybody in film that doesn't know the history of Walter Murch in the era of so-called modern filmmaking, they must be hiding under a rock somewhere. Everything from Apocalypse Now, The Godfather, English Patient, The Conversation, Walter's incredible books, of which we're going to talk about a new one in this conversation. He's a writer, he's directed. I mean, he coined the phrase sound design. That's the very first sentence I ever spoke to you, Walter. I walked in the door with Mark and I said, "You coined the phrase sound design." Very humbly, you acknowledged that fact. But
I think I corrected you on it.
You did you? Yeah?
Yeah. It had been used in theater for 5 or 6 years, 10 years previously. It was the first time on Apocalypse that what somebody like me did was credited as sound design. That was it. And that was mainly because in that case, we were also inventing what has since become 5.1 sound. And so there was a designy element to how do you distribute sounds in this space that has not been used before to such an extent.
Yeah, so there's a nice poetic license that we can take with the fact that nobody uttered that phrase in the context of film until you. But anyway, I'm so grateful to have this conversation with you. And for anyone who's going to watch and listen to this, it's special to me, not only because of Walter's history, but because I've been lucky enough to make 2 films with Walter in the last several years and have gotten to know him and think he's just an incredible person who is brilliant and inspired in ways so far beyond film. And I'm lucky to know him. So I'm lucky to have you here today, Walter.
That's mutual, Robert.
Thank you. Walter, you and I have spoken about this, but I want to just get into something broad for one moment before I ask you about some specific things that I really would love to talk with you about today. And that is that you not only have had an interest in physics, but also metaphysics. And, you know, us composers are always diving into those metaphysical realms because we deal with the unseen all the time. But in your vast history working in film, has your interest in physics and the other more unseen forces realms of metaphysics, were they always present?
Yeah, I think so. I have a fairly clear memory of talking to my best friend in nursery school and wondering, why can't we read each other's thoughts? I'm thinking something now, and you don't know what I'm thinking. But why is that? Why is the world constructed so that we can't just instantly read each other's thoughts? And he got a slightly peculiar expression on his face, wondering, what's this guy talking about? So that goes way back to the age of 4 or 5. So I think it's just the way my particular hairpin is bent.
But you've really delved into concepts like the golden ratio and many other kind of more interesting metaphysical ideas. Were you consciously employing any of those ideas in the early part of your career in film? Or are you coming at it just as a natural progression where you have observed and made discoveries through the years where you can go back and see maybe some of your work followed some of those ideas that you are so incredibly familiar with?
I think it's the second. I didn't certainly consciously use any golden ratio or metaphysical things as I was doing early film work. I was overwhelmed with the technical aspects. You have to remember this is back in the mid 60s and early 70s, and there were all kinds of primitive technologies that were still in place. And yet there was an emerging computerization. The transistorization of film technology was barreling along. So I think it was with advancing age. That's one thing that happens. You start getting a broader view of things. And also just as the technology began to settle down a little bit, and I became more familiar with it all, then other things got into place. There's a line from Gottfried Leibniz, Newton's arch rival for the invention of calculus, who said, "The pleasure we get from music is the pleasure we get from counting without realizing that we're counting." And so I think it's a little bit of that these things are there, but we don't quite realize it, and we get pleasure out of it. And it's only later that we start to look down on ourselves and the work, so to speak, and say, well, maybe that's what's going on. But, it's all still emerging.
There's a parallel for me where people will say, oh, I love that piece of music. How you went from the secondary dominant to, the tonic to the, and I always say, look, we never think about that ever,
Right.
but it's fascinating to analyze certain moves that you've made for whatever reason. I do find it fascinating, but never when creating, that's for sure.
Right. We may get into this later, but this idea of cinematic framing and the use of the so-called golden ratio in film, one of the discoveries I made very late is that cinematographers over the history of cinema, when framing a close-up, which is what I am right now, will tend to place the eyes along the golden ratio of the vertical division of the frame. That's how my framing is. Your framing is not that way. You are lower down.
I know. It's so funny. While you're talking about it, I'm like, I'm trying to fix it right now. Isn't that funny? Yeah.
But I talked to a number of cinematographers, Vittorio Storaro, Caleb Deschanel, John Seal, and said, I just asked basically the same question that you just asked. Were you thinking of this when you did it? And all of them said, absolutely not. John Seal, the cinematographer for Anthony Minghella and the latest Mad Max film, I should add, said, no, I just tried to make the face comfortable within the frame. So if I'm going to, this is not quite so comfortable. And this is not quite so comfortable. So we tend to do this. And so that's one of the chapters in the book that I'm writing is about that and a deeper exploration of why that might be. But I think it's exactly what you're talking about with music. We are responding to things, and we're not doing it necessarily according to some prearranged agenda. It just emerges that, oh, that's good. And it's only later that we can look back. It's basically how everyone learns language. When you're 4 years old, you don't learn the grammar of language. You just start speaking. And it's only later, both individually and in human history, that we say, oh, there must be something like a noun, and there must be a verb, an action word, and there must be an adjective, a qualifying word. But none of those terms are present in the minds of a 4-year-old when they're learning how to speak language.
Yeah, there's definitely a subconscious, I might even say, using this term very broadly because people feel very differently about spiritual things, but there's a spirit thing that a lot of us composers like to think about. Where does this come from? And some kind of instinctive energy drives us. This is both an unseen force, but also a very tangible force. And you recently started to explain this, and I find this utterly fascinating. You exposed me to spliceosomes,
right?
A term I'd never heard. And I was so fascinated, Walter, because you began to paint this picture for me of the incredible parallels between the spliceosome and a person like yourself working on a film in the role of editor. So I would love for you to, if you can, just paint that picture once again for anyone else who's going to enjoy our conversation. I find this utterly fascinating.
Well, I should say that there are even some ethologists, people working in animal studies and biology who don't know about the spliceosome. So it's a term and it's a concept that has emerged over the last 15 or 20 years, more and more. But it's a thing. The spliceosome is like a chromosome or these other protein complexes, molecules that are in every cell that function in interpreting getting information from DNA to outside the cell where proteins can be manufactured outside the nucleus of the cell, to the body of the cell where proteins can be manufactured using this information. And it emerged in the 1970s, 1980s. People began to kind of scratch their head saying, wait a minute, the section of DNA from which this protein is made in the DNA is longer than the information that's used by the ribosome, another some thing, to make the protein. So you have to get with all these somes here. So why is that? And what they discovered was that there was something, in fact, hundreds of thousands of things, little tiny protein complexes, 30 nanometers in diameter, in the nucleus of every cell. And when DNA is copied and an exact copy is made of a section of DNA, these spliceosomes, these protein complexes, grab that piece of RNA, the copy that's being made, and they edit it. They get rid of 90% of it in some cases, which is junk. This is a cruel word to describe what more formally is non-coding information. And that was another discovery that we made around the same time, which is that our DNA is full of junk. There's a lot of misinformation in there that cannot be used to make proteins out of. And it's the job of the spliceosome, this very active protein complex, to, soon as a copy is made, grab it and purify it, and get rid of the junk and the garbage, and that's another term, even worse than junk, and then take what's left, the good stuff, and sometimes get rid of some of it. And so they can make different versions of the same section of DNA, not preserving necessarily the order of the information in the DNA. And once that's done, then the RNA, now called messenger RNA, leaves the nucleus of the cell. It's small enough to go through the wall of the nucleus, and then the ribosome grabs it and makes proteins out of this information, exactly like a machine that we make using a ticker tape of information would make proteins amino acid by amino acid. So it's a new discovery. Lots of things about it are still not known, like where does the information come from that tells this spliceosome what to do? Because for the same section of DNA, it will sometimes do one thing, and then a week later, copying the same section, it'll make a different concoction. So these are things we just don't know. This is active research going on right now, and it's being weaponized, I would say, by the whole thing of the CRISPR scissors that biologists are now using to edit our DNA, to get rid of defective parts of the DNA, sort of to pre-edit our DNA before the spliceosome edits it. So it's a wildly energetic area of research upon which the future of humanity may depend.
The thing is, I'm listening to this, and as we've talked about, the curious parallel is to taking all the information that's shot, vast, perhaps in some cases, vast amounts of hours of footage shot for a film, that somebody like yourself comes in and acts as the spliceosome
right
on a film. And in this case, we know certainly more about that process through the years. It's kind of showing that the microcosm, macrocosm parallels exist everywhere in nature. And in this case, it's right smack into our business.
Right. I mean, that was how I really got interested in all of this, in that biological process that I just talked about was duplicated in, or is duplicated in, how we make films. Certainly, almost accurately, item by item, in how we made films in the old days out of physical negative. That you can think of the DNA as the negative that's shot. And we all know from making films that there's a lot of the negative that is junk, to put it politely. Just you cut off the clapstick, that's a piece of junk. It's necessary at a certain point, but you get rid of it. And then there are flubs and mistakes and, even some things that are ostensibly good, but in the context of the finished film, you don't want them. So we make in film, we have a negative, and then we make a positive copy of that, which is called the work print. And it's an exact copy of the whole section of the negative with the values inverted. And this is also exactly what happens in DNA, that RNA, which is the copy of the DNA, is a negative of the DNA. Each molecule is paired with its opposite molecule. And then it goes to the spliceosome. I'm a spliceosome. I'm the editor. And I cut out the bad bits. I cut out the junk. And then I rearrange the good parts so that it's better under the circumstances. And then I send it on its way. And it goes to the laboratory, which is the ribosome. And there in the ribosome, the positive copy is inverted back to the original negative values of the DNA. White becomes black, black becomes white, and red becomes green, all of that kind of stuff. And then a print is made, which is to say the protein out of which we necessarily need all those proteins and hormones and everything else. And that's the function of that particular analogy between filmmaking and the spliceosome ribosome DNA complex.
I mean, it's absolutely incredible. I can't get enough of just trying to just ponder all of that. And by the way, speaking of spliceosome/editors, all of my editor friends, Walter, every single one of them, you go into their studios and your book and sometimes books, plural, are sitting on their shelves. And
when I hear that,
yeah. And when I mention that you have a new book coming out, they are just absolutely over the moon excited. Now, I certainly wish on you and the world that people, not just us geeking out, in the industry, read the incredible, inspired writings of Walter Murch. I want to see that people well beyond our field being able to kind of enjoy what you write, because it's so inspired.
Oh, thank you.
It's so beyond just the aspects of film and the things that we geek out on. But here we are, not far from the launch of your book. I forget what you told me when it's coming out, but Something Just Clicked. Is that the correct title of the book?
The title is Suddenly Something Clicked, and it will be published by Faber and Faber. I'm still writing it. We were aiming at this time next year. It's still possible, but it depends on me to finish what I'm doing and to get the clearance. I have a lot of illustrations and other things to get the clearance to use them. And publishing a book is a complicated thing. So it's certainly the earliest it could possibly be would be November of 2022. It could be later, but be on the lookout for it.
What was the thing that, if you can crystallize one of the main reasons why you were so driven to write yet another book, is that something that you can articulate, other than that you love to write and that you love sharing your ideas? Was there something else that drove you to do this at this time?
I started taking notes. Oh, that would be an interesting thing to write about. Actually, just about the time that you and I first met, 2012, I started a running list of, this is an interesting thing that I didn't mention in the blink of an eye. And it got longer and longer and longer, but I just kept adding to it. And then when I got to London to work on Coup 53, 3 or 4 years later, I was approached by Faber and Faber. And they said, do you want to write another film book? And I said, actually, I've been keeping a list. So it emerged out of that. It was a combination of, I was already thinking about that, and then somebody just asked me to write a new book. And it progressed from there.
Yeah, there's a lot of pages for people to get into from what it sounds like. And I hope you don't splice-a-some your way through that and edit too much out. I'm
Well,
sure everything.
I mean, I wrote In the Blink of an Eye 30 years ago, and it was based on a lecture that I gave in Australia for the Australian Film Commission. So I was in the middle of editing. So I had not yet edited The English Patient. I was kind of between Unbearable Lightness of Being and Ghost or something. It was in that period. Whereas this is now 30 years later. And, I'm 30 years older, and there's more speculation in there than there was in Blink of an Eye, which had some speculation. The whole theory of the blink is part of it. So it's generally more discursive than In the Blink of an Eye, which means longer. And I haven't gotten to the end of writing the chapters. I'm just following my nose in terms of what I go from chapter to chapter. But at a certain point, a couple of months from now, I'll read everything that I have and either cut it way down. I'll be a terrible spliceosome buzzsaw creature, or it might break apart into 2 books. I don't know. But right now I'm up to 520 pages here, so it's way bigger than Blink of an Eye.
You shared a few chapters with me, and the feeling I get from this is a lot like the feeling I got from when I read Bernstein's book Findings, which he wrote after his many years in the concert hall and writing music and conducting. What an amazing contribution to American music Leonard Bernstein was. But his book Findings was his ability to take all those experiences and speculate and talk about things in a much more broad perspective of that not the technical stuff. It's more, it gets into what profound things get learned from those experiences. So in those, a little bit that I was exposed to, I feel like that's what's contained. You're not just giving people nuts and bolts observations of things to do in film. You're talking about the more intangible and the true things that are important about making art at all. What happens to all of us? What's the experience that is beyond words? And this is why I always try to pick your brain when we're together, because you're all about sharing those feelings. In fact, the 2 films we did, in particular Particle Fever, just the very nature of the film itself requires embracing those more physics and metaphysical concepts. And I just cannot wait to embrace, and read the whole book. We can say that it's about a year away, and it's like they're lined up already outside of Barnes & Noble. Of course, Walter, and by the way, from things like In the Blink of an Eye, I know that a lot of times I'll talk to a sound designer. Recently, I was doing something on it was actually for a commercial, I believe, but the sound designer had done something with a bunch of people walking towards the camera. It was a group of about 8 or 10 people. I said, "Oh, that's a good job. You did a good job with the, even the footsteps seem very clear." And he said to me, "Well, Walter Murch told me, never try to, when you have more than 2 people walking, never try to get all of those footsteps in. Just concentrate on 2. Those things come up all the time. Your disciples are everywhere." I thought that was fun. So, Walter, I wanted to ask you, since you have had such a storied career, and you have been involved in and you have witnessed so many enduring works, and this is something that I find fascinating beyond film, in music, art, everywhere in the creative fields, in every creative endeavor. There's this thing about enduring works. I'm very fascinated by this. You have, in your time, seen an awful lot of work that people refer to constantly. They are enduring. They are embedded in people's consciousness. People, go back and watch them a lot and consider them to be these perfect classics, these masterpieces of sorts. And I certainly listen to a tremendous amount of what I consider to be perfect masterpieces in music all the time. But here we are in 2021, and the thing that I can't feel as much, and I don't know if it's because you just can't seem to look at it in the present, is the idea that there's work in this world that is entering into that classic realm, that are becoming enduring works. And I don't know if it's because listeners and viewers now have a much shorter attention span than ever and don't digest things the same way, or that creators are more forced now than ever to respond to marketplaces. But it seems like we talk about classics and enduring works in the past. But I do think that when I was growing up, something that was bound to become a classic was recognized pretty fast, including so many of your works. Am I getting this wrong? Is there something about feeling that we are not there right now with creating those lasting experiences in film and in music like we were? And if you agree at all, I'd love to know your theories on those things, because that fascinates me. We have so much more disposable art.
Well, I think if you went back to, I don't know, 1846 and forced yourself to listen to every piece of music that was performed in 1846 and read every single novel that was published in 1846, you would be amazed at how much junk there was, speaking of the spliceosome, that, we can't predict what will endure from that time. And yes, certain things were recognized instantly back then, and certain things were recognized fairly quickly today, but some didn't. I mean, the conversation, I'm going to a screening of The Conversation on Saturday with a Q&A afterwards. And we shot that film almost 50 years ago. That's, half a century ago. And it didn't do a lot of business at the time. It got nominated for Best Picture, so it was recognized, but it was certainly, it flew under all kinds of radar. Interestingly, the person who's interviewing me is a geneticist from Berkeley who was an expert in the spliceosome and in CRISPR scissors and all of that kind of stuff. So it'll be interesting to talk about the process of editing film with somebody who edits DNA. So I don't agree with you, basically, that I think it's something that emerges over time, and it's very hard to predict. Certainly, there are a truth about human relations and something that endures. They will remain, kind of like, certain rock formations remain in the desert after everything else erodes away, and you see these things sticking up out of the desert. That's sort of what goes on, I think.
I wanted to engage with you in that idea, just because I do think about these things a lot. And I do feel that there's a lot of pressure to respond to your career path. And I think that unfortunately gets in the way sometimes, people being able to be driven by the things that just simply move them, regardless of whether or not they are good career moves or not.
Right.
It's all around me. This is the way our agents think, and this will be good for you. This is a good move. But the only really strong move for an artist is to do it because, as one or two 20th century composers have mentioned, to not do it would kill you. You just simply have to create. When you were, we were talking about you and your colleagues coming up in a time, and this connects to this idea, when the old guard Hollywood was saying it's over. It's now about television and other things, but you guys are coming in at the wrong time. Good luck to you. But you and George Lucas, Francis Ford Coppola, all your group were heading straight towards what the old guard was saying was over. Maybe that's the same idea. You were just so driven and so moved by what you wanted to do with the art form that nobody could talk about whether or not something was over or not, or going to be a dead end career. Is that fair to say? That experience for you and your colleagues?
Yeah, I would say fair enough. What is it that drives people to do what they do? It's a little bit of a mystery. Certainly for a lot of us, one of the drives was stay out of Vietnam. We were taking cover in graduate school in film in order not to be sent to Vietnam. So there's a practical level there, and but we were kind of aware that the film business in the United States was in a transition phase, but we were mostly inspired by filmmaking in other countries, the French New Wave and Bergman in Sweden and Fellini in Italy and Kurosawa in Japan. That those were the films that really got us excited. A few American directors, Stanley Kubrick, notably among them. So it's hard to drill back into your state of mind when you were 22, but I think we certainly at American Zoetrope, when we started that, it was to find a way to Europeanize American cinema and to also film schoolize the process of making films. In the mid-60s, the old guard studios were very regimented and very separate. Each craft was very separate from the next craft. Legally, you couldn't do this, you had to ask this person to do that. A person who edited sound could not also mix the sound. Those were two different crafts. And we had not experienced this in film school. We did everything. And we moved from Los Angeles to San Francisco in order to have the freedom there to have this mix of stuff. And that has certainly taken the day now. That's partly through our influence and the influence of technology that is allowed now. You can edit sound effects and also mix the sound effects. That's permitted. So on a technical level and a workflow level, but also on a cultural level, those are things that we were interested. But again, we were very young, and you'd have to drill down pretty deep to get at some of these things, which only emerges later with some perspective.
Yeah. Now, on the order of technology and different things that happen now in film, your incredible story of the 9 months, I think you said, was the mix for Apocalypse Now. Is it fair to say that the tools that you now work with, the things that you did Crew 53 on, Particle Fever, etc., that had you had any of that technology, that the 9 months would have been, I don't know, maybe cut in half? Or do you think that it was more about the thinking and the experimenting that caused to have an almost year-long mix for Apocalypse Now?
Yeah, you have to understand that we were mixing in a format that nobody had mixed in before, this proto 5.1 system. And there was no mix stage in the world equipped that, so we were building one. So we were mixing the film while we were also building the stage on which we were mixing it. And it was the first multi-channel film to use automation ever. So we were learning how to use very primitive automation, and only the volume faders were automated. None of the equalization or the assigns or any of those things which are now automated were not. And so it was complicated. I would be in the middle of a mix and somebody would come through with a soldering gun and say, "Can you stop for a minute? I have to do something here." And the film was also being edited while I was mixing the film. So there were changes upon changes so it was all of those things. But I think one of the main things was simply the fact that the studio in which we were mixing was being built at the same time that we were doing the mix. So there was lots of downtime while we waited for stuff to be taken care of.
With film sound, Walter, you are absolutely the master of immersion. People have to be. There's no way to not fully pay attention to and focus on your films, any one of them that you were involved in, because the sound is reaching out of the screen and just grabbing you by the neck sometimes. And that to me is what the cinema is all about. People now, they watch things on their phones, they watch things in their computer. Sometimes they're, they have good systems at home, but like Tagi, director, for anyone who's watching this and doesn't know, Tagi Amirani, the director of Coup 53, who with Walter, teamed up, and I was lucky enough to score the film. But Tagi was always fond of saying, you can't really watch this at home. We have to go to a theater. This is the only way to watch anything that Walter touches. And I heartily agree with that. I know it's not always possible. And we don't want people to not watch things just because of that, especially after COVID and all of that stuff. But my gosh, Walter, you have schooled everybody on those concepts. I don't know if there's anything that you would wish to share with any of the sound designers that are likely to watch this about this very subject of just use of sound to make sure that people are fully engaged. But, I'd love to know if there's something about that you'd like to share.
Yeah, sure. It's the buzzword of the last year is immersive. And it's, it's a buzzword, and you have to take it for what it's worth. I don't know. We were mixing Jarhead in New York at Sound One on 54th Street, a studio that's now gone.
Sure.
And it was up on the 7th floor, I think, of this building, a big studio. And we would be mixing all day and making these minute decisions of, I think the clink in the left surround could come up by 1 or 2 dB, these sort of sophisticated things. And at the end of the day, to get down to street level, you would ride down in an operated elevator. It was not an automated elevator. And the operator worked all day, and when nobody was in the elevator, he would watch films on a Game Boy or something. And so I would be making these sophisticated decisions, and then at the end of the day, ride down with, I forget his name, and he'd be watching something on a screen that was this big with 2 little tinny speakers. And it was a curative for any kind of overwhelming pride of what you're doing, because most of it is going to wind up like that. So, you have to accept that as part of the process. And technically, I'm for whatever reason, I'm not overly fond of multiple tracks. Let's say Atmos. It's immersive technically, but I think that brings up all kinds of problems. And even when I was doing 5.1 on Apocalypse, we were very strict about certain things that should not appear in the surround channels. And I sort of adhere to that today. Don't put dialogue in the surround channels unless there's absolute chaos going on in the scene. Now, Alfonso Cuarón, a wonderful filmmaker, loves to put dialogue in the surrounds. More power to him. It's just not something that I like to do. So it's, I think the immersion part comes more in the, what I would call metaphoric sound, but it's sounds that at first hearing don't quite make a lot of sense. Why should I be hearing that when I'm looking at this? And so the mind struggles to figure out, again, subconsciously, what's going on here. And it will make some connection that is very personal to the person who's doing the listening. And if you can do that, then the film acquires a psychic dimensionality over the technical dimensionality of that sound here, that sound there, and that sound coming from the back. Those, to me, if overused, can alienate the very process that they're trying to encourage. I mean, the example that I use for what I'm talking about is the sound of the elevator train in Godfather when Michael is about to kill Sollozzo. And Godfather was a mono film. There was no stereo anywhere on the horizon for that film at the time. And so it's a sound that comes and goes in the scene, even though it has nothing to do with what you're looking at. It's just a sound. What is that? And it gets particularly loud in the moments before Michael stands up and kills Sollozzo and kills McCluskey. And in general, the audience tends to accept that sound as coming from somewhere, the environment, but there's also a psychic dimension, which is Michael is making a decision now that's going to change his life. And so in a sense, that aggressive sound is sort of the sounds of his neurons rubbing against each other as he comes to make this momentous decision. And then as soon as he pulls the trigger, that sound, which is at its peak, suddenly cuts out, and you're left with this absolute silence in which, the people in the restaurant stare in wonder at what has just happened. And then Michael exits frame, and very close to the camera, he does what Clemenza had told him to do, which is to drop the gun. So, I put that sound in for all kinds of reasons, but one of them was to achieve that immersive effect, but it's a psychic immersion rather than a technical immersion. So my hope is that the films that I work on will work whatever, whether it's Ernesto in the elevator on 54th Street or watching them in an Atmos theater with all of the bells and whistles.
Well, you have done that with everything, and that's an understatement. I mean, gosh, that just even in the Beacon Theater, listening to Apocalypse Now and that Redux that I was able to attend with you was just listening in that theater, and that's not optimal. That's not like going up to George Lucas's theater or anything, but just the incredible detail and the profound effect of it all.
Yeah, that the Beacon was a terrible theater to experience that stuff in, because it's such an old and reverberant theater. So it was agony for me sitting in the audience.
I'll bet. But you mentioned how Ernesto, or whatever his name is, was watching films on that little Game Boy. That's the macro odd thing. But if it's incredibly moving and exciting to hear anywhere, it's a magnificent accomplishment. I've certainly been on other films where that level of achievement did not quite happen, because there was no Walter Murch in the room with me. Walter, I know that the Zoom link, I think it's an hour long, and I could talk to you for hours about all these things. I wanted to use the last couple of minutes and I don't know if you can answer this question, but in all of the incredible pieces that you've done in film, and I'm concentrating on film, obviously your career, as I said much earlier, it encompasses so many other things, not just feature films. But is it even possible for you to say, this is my fondest memory of working on a film? This was really, yeah. I mean, I'm not surprised, because that would be hard for me to do. But so there's nothing. Maybe then I should ask you this: what was perhaps the most difficult experience where you thought, this thing is never going to happen, we're never going to finish it, it's never going to work? If you were to try to identify that, what would that be?
Well, I shook my head and said no, but I would say 3 films, and I select them because they were early in my career, and it was just trying to figure out how to do certain things, and then a light bulb goes off, and that's how you can do it. And working in the relative isolation of mixing sound in San Francisco, away from Hollywood, which is where things, they knew how to do things down in Hollywood, and in San Francisco, we didn't know how to do it. So we had to invent certain things that we wanted to try. And, American Graffiti, which was an overt use of what I came to call worldizing of the music, to put music, again, this was a mono film, but how do you spatialize music in a film where there is, out of 120 minutes, whatever it was, there's 106 minutes of music. How do you do that without driving the audience crazy? And George and I developed something that I had used in a small way in Godfather, and kind of did a whole number on it with all of the rock and roll music in American Graffiti. To basically, what we did was we created a depth of field for sound, so that when you wanted, in the transitions between scenes where you wanted the music to be full, you could play it full. And then when you wanted it to recede into the background but not disappear, how could you do that and still maintain its presence without it becoming annoying? And the way to do that was to worldize it, to re-record it in the actual environment in which it technically appears, a street scene or a gymnasium or the interior of a car. So we did all of those things, and then I could fade to this worldized quality, which basically puts the sound out of focus. It doesn't have any precise edges, and it's the dialogue now that has sharp edges, so the ear knows what it should be listening to. It's exactly what we do when we take a portrait of somebody. We use a long lens, we keep the eyes of the person in focus, and we throw the background out of focus so that you see the portrait and you know instantly what you're supposed to be looking at. That's what that did. So that's that. Conversation, because it's a film about sound. It's about the man who records sound. So it was ways of psychologically getting into that particular headspace. And then Apocalypse, because it was the invention of 5.1 sound and how you could use that creatively on a very ambitious edge of the precipice kind of a film. It took a long time to make the film. Francis started shooting it on almost the same day that George started shooting Star Wars, March 26th or something, 1976. Wow. And Star Wars came out in May of the next year, and it took another 2 years for Apocalypse Plus. 2 years plus. Apocalypse came out in August of 1979. So we would joke saying we're going to be a permanent exhibit of here are the people who are working on a film that they started 20 years ago and they're still working on it. But it didn't happen. We finished the film, but it was challenging on all kinds of technical and artistic levels.
Wow. Oh my God. I mean, anyone who appreciates all of that work so much, me included, it's such a gift to hear you talk about it. Now, Walter, I want to personally thank you once again.
Sure.
I love, that we were able to do it. And I like having these intimate conversations with the most inspired people that I know. And I can tell you that I really, really hope, this is selfish, I really hope not only that you and I get to work on another film, but that, when people do come knocking on the door and try to tempt you into it, that after the book's done and all that, that you have another yes or two to say to another big film project.
We'll see.
It's just nothing like Okay. Yeah, so we will talk soon. Good luck with the screenings, and thanks, Walter.
Sure thing.